Question 1. Investigation of a clinical trial in Alabama for a new pain management medication reveals that the principal investigator is obtaining consent from patients currently receiving treatment at the hospital. The investigator provides a brief overview of the study and asks patients to sign a consent form. Some patients appear to be in significant discomfort, and the investigator notes that participation could potentially lead to faster access to experimental treatments. What is the most ethically sound and legally compliant approach for the principal investigator to ensure valid informed consent in this Alabama-based study? Option A. Provide a brief verbal explanation of the study and obtain a signature on the consent form, focusing primarily on meeting recruitment targets for the trial. Option B. Proceed with the study after obtaining a signature on the consent form, assuming that adult patients are capable of making their own decisions and that the potential for faster access to treatment is sufficient incentive for participation. Option C. Implement a comprehensive informed consent process that includes a clear explanation of the voluntary nature of participation, the right to withdraw without affecting current or future care, a detailed description of risks and benefits in understandable language, an active assessment of comprehension, with additional safeguards to prevent coercion or undue influence given the patient-provider relationship. Option D. Minimize discussion of potential risks and emphasize the potential benefits of the experimental treatment to encourage enrollment, given the urgent need for new pain management options. Correct answer is C. Implement a comprehensive informed consent process that includes a clear explanation of the voluntary nature of participation, the right to withdraw without affecting current or future care, a detailed description of risks and benefits in understandable language, an active assessment of comprehension, with additional safeguards to prevent coercion or undue influence given the patient-provider relationship. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between advancing scientific knowledge and protecting the autonomy and well-being of vulnerable research participants. The researcher must navigate the ethical imperative to obtain informed consent with the potential for coercion or undue influence when dealing with individuals who may be dependent on the institution for care or resources. Alabama Bioethics Law, like broader ethical frameworks, emphasizes the protection of human subjects, particularly those in potentially compromised positions. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves a multifaceted strategy to ensure genuine informed consent. This includes clearly explaining the voluntary nature of participation, the right to withdraw at any time without penalty, and the potential risks and benefits in language understandable to the participant. Crucially, it requires implementing safeguards to mitigate any potential for coercion or undue influence, such as having an independent party present during the consent process, or ensuring that participation or non-participation does not affect the participant's access to care or other essential services. This aligns with the core ethical principles of respect for persons, autonomy, and beneficence, as mandated by Alabama's ethical guidelines for human subjects research, which prioritize participant understanding and freedom from coercion. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves proceeding with the research after a brief verbal explanation of the study and obtaining a signature on a consent form without actively assessing the participant's comprehension or addressing potential power imbalances. This fails to uphold the principle of autonomy, as true consent requires understanding, and it risks violating the participant's right to make a free choice, especially given their status as patients. This approach neglects the ethical obligation to ensure that consent is not merely a procedural step, but a meaningful affirmation of voluntary participation. Another incorrect approach is to assume that because the participant is an adult, they are fully capable of understanding and consenting to research without further clarification or safeguards, even if they are experiencing significant pain or distress. While adult status is a prerequisite for consent, it does not automatically guarantee comprehension or the absence of undue influence. Alabama's ethical guidelines require researchers to be sensitive to the participant's condition and to take extra precautions to ensure their understanding and voluntariness, especially when their capacity might be temporarily or permanently affected by their medical situation. A third incorrect approach is to prioritize the recruitment goals of the study over the participant's genuine understanding and willingness to participate, perhaps by downplaying risks or exaggerating potential benefits. This directly contravenes the principle of beneficence and non-maleficence, as it places the research agenda above the welfare of the human subject. Such an approach erodes trust and violates the fundamental ethical duty to protect participants from harm, and to ensure that their participation is truly voluntary and informed. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a participant-centered approach. This involves proactively identifying potential vulnerabilities, employing clear and accessible communication, actively assessing comprehension, and implementing robust safeguards against coercion and undue influence. The decision-making process should be guided by a commitment to the core ethical principles of respect for persons, beneficence, and justice, as reflected in Alabama's specific regulatory framework for human subjects research. When in doubt, erring on the side of caution to protect the participants' rights and welfare is always the professionally responsible course of action. Question 2. Assessment of a patient's understanding of a proposed surgical procedure for a fractured tibia in an emergency room setting in Birmingham, Alabama, is crucial. The patient, Mr. Henderson, appears anxious and repeatedly states, "Just fix it." He has a history of mild cognitive impairment due to a previous stroke. The attending physician needs to obtain informed consent. Which of the following approaches best upholds Mr. Henderson's rights and Alabama's legal requirements for informed consent? Option A. Clearly explain the risks, benefits, and alternatives of the surgery in simple terms. Observe Mr. Henderson's responses for comprehension, and if doubt persists regarding his capacity, initiate a formal capacity assessment. Option B. Postpone the surgery until Mr. Henderson can be evaluated by a neurologist to definitively determine his cognitive status, even though his fracture requires prompt intervention. Option C. Proceed with the surgery immediately as Mr. Henderson has verbally agreed to the treatment by saying, "Just fix it." Option D. Seek consent from Mr. Henderson's daughter, who is present, without first assessing Mr. Henderson's own understanding or capacity. The correct answer is A. Clearly explain the risks, benefits, and alternatives of the surgery in simple terms. Observe Mr. Henderson's responses for comprehension, and if doubt persists regarding his capacity, initiate a formal capacity assessment. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common yet ethically complex challenge in healthcare, ensuring truly informed consent when a patient's capacity to understand is compromised by their medical condition. The professional challenge lies in balancing the patient's right to self-determination with the ethical and legal obligation to protect them from harm and ensure decisions are made with genuine comprehension. The urgency of the situation, coupled with the patient's apparent distress and potential cognitive impairment, necessitates careful judgment to avoid coercion or overlooking critical information. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a multifaceted approach that prioritizes assessing and supporting the patient's decision-making capacity. This includes clearly and simply explaining the proposed treatment, its benefits, risks, and alternatives in a manner understandable to the patient, and actively soliciting their questions and concerns. Crucially, it involves observing the patient's responses for signs of comprehension or confusion, and if doubt remains about their capacity, initiating a formal capacity assessment. This approach aligns with Alabama's informed consent statutes, which mandate that consent be given by a person with the capacity to understand the nature and consequences of the proposed treatment. The Alabama Medical Consent Law emphasizes the patient's right to be informed and to refuse treatment, presupposing a competent decision-maker. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves proceeding with the treatment based solely on the patient's verbal agreement without a thorough assessment of their understanding. This fails to meet the Alabama legal standard for informed consent, which requires more than mere assent. It demands comprehension. Patient's distress could be masking a lack of understanding, and proceeding without confirming this could lead to a violation of their autonomy and potential harm if they did not truly grasp the implications. Another unacceptable approach is to bypass the patient and seek consent from a family member without first attempting to ascertain the patient's own wishes and capacity. While family involvement is often beneficial, Alabama law generally prioritizes the patient's right to make their own decisions unless they are legally incapacitated and a designated surrogate is involved. This approach risks overriding the patient's autonomy and may not reflect their true desires. A third flawed approach is to delay the necessary treatment indefinitely due to concerns about the patient's capacity, without actively seeking to clarify their understanding or explore options for supporting their decision-making. While caution is warranted, prolonged delay can be detrimental to the patient's health and contradicts the ethical imperative to provide timely and appropriate care. This approach fails to proactively address the capacity issue and may lead to a worse outcome. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a presumption of capacity, but actively seeks to confirm it. This involves clear communication, patient-centered questioning, and observation. If capacity is uncertain, the next step is a formal assessment, potentially involving a multidisciplinary team. Documentation of the assessment process, the patient's responses, and the rationale for any decision regarding capacity or consent is paramount. This systematic approach ensures that patient rights are respected, ethical obligations are met, and legal requirements are satisfied under Alabama law. Question 3. Benchmark analysis indicates that a physician in Alabama is treating a patient with a validly executed advance directive that clearly states a desire to refuse blood transfusions. The patient is now experiencing a life-threatening hemorrhage, and the physician believes a transfusion is the only way to save the patient's life. The patient is currently unable to communicate their wishes directly. What is the most appropriate course of action for the physician to take? Option A. Attempt to locate and contact the patient's family members, even if they are not designated as healthcare agents, to discuss the situation and seek their consent for the transfusion. Option B. Administer the blood transfusion immediately, as the physician's primary duty is to preserve the patient's life, overriding the advance directive in this emergent situation. Option C. Proceed with the blood transfusion based on the physician's medical judgment that it is in the patient's best interest, without further consultation, given the life-threatening nature of the hemorrhage. Option D. Consult with the hospital's ethics committee and legal counsel to review the advance directive's applicability and seek guidance on how to proceed, while ensuring the patient's designated healthcare agent is involved in discussions. The correct answer is D. Consult with the hospital's ethics committee and legal counsel to review the advance directive's applicability and seek guidance on how to proceed, while ensuring the patient's designated healthcare agent is involved in discussions. Explanation. Benchmark analysis indicates that navigating complex ethical dilemmas involving patient autonomy and the interpretation of advance directives requires a thorough understanding of Alabama case law and judicial precedents. This scenario is professionally challenging because it pits a patient's expressed wishes, documented in an advance directive, against the immediate medical judgment of the attending physician, who believes a different course of action is in the patient's best interest. The physician's concern for the patient's well-being, coupled with the potential for misinterpretation of the advance directive or unforeseen medical circumstances, creates significant ethical and legal tension. Careful judgment is required to balance the patient's right to self-determination with the physician's duty of care. The best professional approach involves a multifaceted strategy that prioritizes respecting the patient's autonomy while ensuring all legal and ethical obligations are met. This includes a thorough review of the advance directive to ascertain its clarity, scope, and applicability to the current medical situation, as well as engaging in open and compassionate communication with the patient's designated healthcare agent or surrogate decision-maker. Crucially, this approach necessitates consulting with the hospital's ethics committee and seeking legal counsel if there is any ambiguity or dispute regarding the validity or interpretation of the advance directive, or if the physician's concerns are substantial and not easily resolved through discussion. Alabama law, as interpreted through case law such as Ex Parte Health Care Authority of City of Mobile, 790 So. 2D 914, ALA, 2000, emphasizes the importance of respecting a patient's right to refuse medical treatment, even if that refusal is based on an advance directive, provided the directive is valid and clearly expresses the patient's wishes. Seeking expert guidance from an ethics committee and legal counsel ensures that the decision-making process is legally sound and ethically defensible, aligning with the principles of patient autonomy and informed consent as understood within Alabama's legal framework. An incorrect approach would be to unilaterally override the advance directive based solely on the physician's personal medical judgment, without further investigation or consultation. This fails to uphold the patient's fundamental right to self-determination, a principle deeply embedded in Alabama Bioethics Law and supported by judicial precedent. Such an action could lead to legal challenges and ethical breaches by disregarding a legally recognized expression of the patient's wishes. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to dismiss the advance directive entirely due to a perceived lack of clarity, without first attempting to interpret it in good faith or seeking clarification from the patient's agent or legal experts. This demonstrates a failure to engage with the patient's expressed desires and may violate the spirit, if not the letter, of Alabama's advance directive statutes. Finally, proceeding with a treatment contrary to the advance directive, without any attempt to involve the patient's surrogate or seek ethical or legal consultation, is a significant ethical and legal misstep. This bypasses established protocols for resolving disputes and respecting patient rights, potentially exposing healthcare providers and the institution to liability and undermining trust in the healthcare system. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. First, meticulously review all relevant documentation, including the advance directive and any supporting legal or medical records. Second, engage in clear, empathetic communication with the patient's surrogate decision-maker. Third, if any doubt or conflict arises, immediately consult with the institution's ethics committee. Fourth, if ethical or legal ambiguities persist, seek formal legal counsel. This systematic process ensures that patient rights are protected, legal obligations are met, and decisions are ethically sound. Question 4. Process analysis reveals that a principal investigator in Alabama is planning a research study involving human participants that could potentially benefit from adhering to certain principles outlined in an international bioethics convention, though these specific principles are not explicitly codified in Alabama state law. The investigator is concerned about the ethical implications of proceeding without considering these international guidelines. Which of the following represents the most professionally responsible course of action? Option A. Immediately consult with the Institutional Review Board (IRB) and seek advice from legal counsel specializing in bioethics and international law regarding the study's ethical and legal implications. Option B. Proceed with the research as planned, assuming that without explicit Alabama state law mandating adherence, the international convention's principles are not binding. Option C. Disregard the international convention entirely, focusing solely on compliance with existing Alabama state regulations for the research. Option D. Independently modify the research protocol to align with the investigator's interpretation of the international convention's principles without consulting the IRB or legal counsel. The correct answer is A. Immediately consult with the Institutional Review Board (IRB) and seek advice from legal counsel specializing in bioethics and international law regarding the study's ethical and legal implications. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it involves a conflict between the immediate needs of a research project in Alabama and the broader ethical obligations established by international bioethics treaties. The principal investigator must navigate the legal and ethical landscape of Alabama, while also considering the implications of adhering to or deviating from international norms that may not be directly codified in state law, but represent a global consensus on responsible research conduct. The pressure to advance scientific discovery must be balanced against the imperative to uphold human dignity and rights as articulated in international agreements. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves proactively seeking guidance from the Institutional Review Board (IRB) and consulting with legal counsel specializing in bioethics and international law. This approach is correct because it acknowledges the limitations of the principal investigator's direct authority and the need for expert review. The IRB is mandated to ensure research involving human subjects complies with ethical principles and relevant regulations, including those informed by international standards. Consulting legal counsel ensures that any actions taken are compliant with both Alabama law and the spirit of international bioethics treaties, even if direct enforcement mechanisms for those treaties are not present at the state level. This upholds the principle of ethical research oversight and responsible scientific practice. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach involves proceeding with the research as planned without seeking external ethical or legal review, assuming that since the specific treaty provisions are not explicitly enacted into Alabama law, they are not binding. This is ethically and professionally unacceptable because it disregards the foundational principles of international bioethics that often inform domestic ethical guidelines and best practices. It risks violating the spirit of human rights and dignity that underpins these treaties, potentially leading to reputational damage and undermining public trust in research. Another incorrect approach is to unilaterally decide to modify the research protocol to align with the treaty provisions without consulting the IRB or legal counsel. While seemingly proactive, this bypasses the established oversight mechanisms designed to ensure comprehensive ethical review and legal compliance. The modifications might be insufficient, misinterpret the treaty's intent, or create unintended legal or ethical complications that only expert review could identify. A further incorrect approach is to dismiss the relevance of the international treaty entirely, arguing that Alabama's specific regulations are the sole governing framework. This demonstrates a narrow and potentially isolationist view of bioethics. International treaties and conventions represent a global consensus on ethical conduct and often serve as benchmarks for domestic ethical standards. Ignoring them can lead to research practices that, while technically compliant with minimal state requirements, fall short of globally accepted ethical norms, potentially hindering international collaboration and scientific recognition. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such dilemmas should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes ethical integrity and robust oversight. This involves 1. Identifying the core ethical and legal issues, including potential conflicts between local regulations and international norms. 2. Recognizing the limitations of individual expertise and the necessity of consulting relevant oversight bodies, like IRBs and legal experts. 3. Evaluating potential risks and benefits of different courses of action, considering not only legal compliance, but also ethical implications and reputational impact. 4. Documenting all consultations and decisions thoroughly. 5. Adhering to the principle of do no harm and upholding the dignity and rights of research participants, even when faced with ambiguity in the regulatory landscape. Question 5. The performance metrics show a statistically significant increase in post-operative complications for a particular elective surgical procedure performed at a Birmingham, Alabama hospital over the past 6 months. The hospital administration is concerned about the financial implications of extended patient stays and readmissions. Which of the following approaches best upholds the principle of beneficence within the framework of Alabama Bioethics Law? Option A. Classify the increased complication rate as an acceptable margin of error for this type of procedure and continue current protocols without further investigation. Option B. Recommend the immediate cessation of the surgical procedure at the hospital without a thorough investigation into the causes of the complications or consultation with the affected surgical team. Option C. Initiate a comprehensive review of the surgical procedure's performance data. Engage the surgical team to identify potential contributing factors to the complications, and explore evidence-based interventions to improve patient outcomes and post-operative care. Option D. Immediately implement stricter cost containment measures for post-operative care related to this procedure, such as reducing staffing levels in recovery units to mitigate financial losses. The correct answer is C. Initiate a comprehensive review of the surgical procedure's performance data. Engage the surgical team to identify potential contributing factors to the complications, and explore evidence-based interventions to improve patient outcomes and post-operative care. Explanation. The performance metrics show a concerning trend in patient outcomes for a specific surgical procedure at a hospital in Alabama. This scenario is professionally challenging because it pits the hospital's financial interests and operational efficiency against the paramount ethical principle of beneficence, which mandates acting in the best interest of the patient. Balancing resource allocation, physician autonomy, and the duty to provide optimal care requires careful ethical deliberation and adherence to Alabama's bioethics framework. The best approach involves a comprehensive, multifaceted risk assessment that prioritizes patient well-being. This entails a thorough review of the surgical procedure's performance data, including complication rates, readmission statistics, and patient-reported outcomes, specifically within the context of Alabama's established standards for medical care and patient rights. It requires engaging directly with the surgical team to understand potential contributing factors, exploring alternative treatment pathways, and assessing the feasibility and safety of implementing enhanced post-operative care protocols or additional training. This approach aligns with the Alabama Bioethics Law's emphasis on patient welfare and the physician's duty to act beneficently, ensuring that decisions are grounded in evidence and patient-centered care, rather than solely on cost-effectiveness or convenience. An approach that focuses solely on identifying cost-saving measures, without a parallel commitment to investigating and rectifying the underlying causes of the adverse outcomes, is ethically deficient. This would violate the principle of beneficence by potentially sacrificing patient safety for financial gain. Furthermore, it fails to uphold the Alabama Bioethics Law's mandate for transparency and accountability in healthcare delivery. Another unacceptable approach would be to dismiss the performance metrics as statistical anomalies without a rigorous investigation. This demonstrates a disregard for the potential harm to patients and a failure to fulfill the ethical obligation to continuously improve care. Such an approach neglects the proactive duty to identify and mitigate risks inherent in medical practice, which is a cornerstone of beneficence. Finally, an approach that involves immediately discontinuing the procedure without adequate investigation or consultation with the surgical team and patients would be premature and potentially harmful. While the principle of non-maleficence, do no harm, is crucial, beneficence also requires acting to promote good. This might involve modifying the procedure, enhancing support, or providing further training rather than outright cessation, unless the risks are deemed unacceptably high and unmitigable. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the ethical dilemma. Next, they should gather all relevant facts, including performance data, patient feedback, and clinical expertise. This should be followed by identifying stakeholders and their interests. Then, they should explore alternative courses of action, evaluating each against ethical principles, beneficence, non-maleficence, autonomy, justice, and relevant Alabama bioethics laws and guidelines. Finally, they should select the best course of action, implement it, and then evaluate its effectiveness. Question 6. The efficiency study reveals that a proposed research protocol in Alabama may require patients to consent to data usage that extends beyond the immediate therapeutic context, potentially challenging the historical understanding of patient autonomy in the state. Which of the following approaches best navigates this ethical and legal challenge? Option A. Conduct a comprehensive review of Alabama's bioethics statutes and relevant case law to determine the current legal definition and scope of informed consent and patient autonomy as interpreted within the state. Option B. Rely on the historical interpretation of patient autonomy in Alabama, without further investigation into how evolving research methodologies might necessitate a broader understanding of consent. Option C. Implement the research protocol as designed, assuming that general ethical principles of research autonomy are universally applicable and supersede any specific state-level nuances. Option D. Adopt the informed consent procedures commonly used in other states with similar research initiatives, without independently verifying their compliance with Alabama's specific bioethics laws. The correct answer is A. Conduct a comprehensive review of Alabama's bioethics statutes and relevant case law to determine the current legal definition and scope of informed consent and patient autonomy as interpreted within the state. Explanation. The efficiency study reveals a potential conflict between the historical understanding of patient autonomy in Alabama and the evolving landscape of informed consent in complex medical research. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing established ethical principles with the practical demands of modern research protocols, particularly when those protocols might subtly alter the traditional scope of patient decision-making. Careful judgment is required to ensure that any deviation from historical norms is ethically justified and legally compliant within Alabama's specific bioethics framework. The best approach involves a thorough review of Alabama's bioethics statutes and case law concerning informed consent and patient autonomy. This includes examining the legislative intent behind key provisions and how courts have interpreted them in analogous situations. By grounding the decision in the specific legal and ethical precedents of Alabama, researchers can ensure that the informed consent process accurately reflects the current legal understanding of patient rights and responsibilities within the state. This approach prioritizes legal compliance and ethical integrity by adhering strictly to the established regulatory framework. An incorrect approach would be to rely solely on general ethical guidelines for research, without cross-referencing them with Alabama's specific bioethics laws. While general guidelines offer valuable principles, they may not fully capture the nuances of state-specific legal requirements, potentially leading to noncompliance. Another incorrect approach is to assume that historical interpretations of patient autonomy are sufficient without considering how recent advancements in medical research might necessitate a re-evaluation within the current legal context of Alabama. This overlooks the dynamic nature of bioethics law and its adaptation to new scientific realities. Finally, adopting a protocol based on the practices of other states or jurisdictions, without verifying their alignment with Alabama's specific legal and ethical standards, is a significant failure. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a disregard for the unique regulatory environment of Alabama. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the specific jurisdiction's regulatory landscape. This involves consulting primary legal sources, such as statutes and judicial decisions, relevant to the ethical issue at hand. Next, they should analyze how these legal requirements intersect with established ethical principles. Finally, they must apply this synthesized understanding to the specific research scenario, ensuring that all actions are both legally sound and ethically defensible within the governing jurisdiction. Question 7. Quality control measures reveal that a physician in Alabama is treating a patient who has clearly and verbally refused a life-sustaining treatment, stating they understand the consequences. The physician, however, believes this refusal is not in the patient's best medical interest and is considering proceeding with the treatment against the patient's wishes. Which of the following approaches best upholds the patient's rights under Alabama Bioethics Law? Option A. Immediately assume the patient lacks decision-making capacity and proceed with the treatment without further assessment. Option B. Respect the patient's informed refusal of treatment, ensuring they fully understand the implications and document the decision. Option C. Delay the treatment indefinitely without further discussion or reassessment to avoid confronting the patient's refusal. Option D. Proceed with the treatment, believing it is in the patient's best medical interest, overriding their stated refusal. The correct answer is B. Respect the patient's informed refusal of treatment, ensuring they fully understand the implications and document the decision. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it pits a healthcare provider's perception of a patient's best interest against the patient's explicit wishes, creating a direct conflict with fundamental patient rights. The provider must navigate the complex ethical terrain of beneficence versus autonomy, while also adhering to Alabama law regarding informed consent and patient decision-making capacity. The risk of legal repercussions and ethical breaches necessitates a careful and legally compliant approach. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves respecting the patient's right to refuse treatment, even if the provider believes it is not in the patient's best medical interest. This approach aligns with the Alabama Bioethics Law, which emphasizes patient autonomy and the right to make informed decisions about their own health care. Specifically, Alabama law recognizes a patient's right to refuse medical treatment, provided they have the capacity to make such a decision. The provider's duty is to ensure the patient is fully informed of the risks, benefits, and alternatives to the proposed treatment, and that their refusal is voluntary and not the result of coercion or misunderstanding. If capacity is in doubt, a formal assessment process should be initiated, not a unilateral decision to override the patient's stated wishes. Incorrect approaches analysis. Overriding the patient's stated refusal based solely on the provider's judgment of what is medically best for the patient is a direct violation of Alabama bioethics law. This approach disregards the patient's autonomy and right to self-determination, which are cornerstones of ethical medical practice. Proceeding with treatment without renewed consent after the patient has explicitly refused, it constitutes a battery. Another incorrect approach would be to immediately assume the patient lacks capacity and proceed with treatment under the guise of beneficence without a proper capacity assessment. This bypasses the legal and ethical requirements for determining decision-making capacity and infringes upon the patient's rights. Finally, delaying treatment indefinitely without further discussion or reassessment, while appearing to respect the refusal, could also be problematic if it leads to significant deterioration of the patient's condition, potentially creating a new ethical dilemma and failing to adequately address the patient's underlying health needs within the bounds of their rights. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes patient autonomy and legal compliance. This involves 1. confirming the patient's understanding of their condition and the proposed treatment, including risks, benefits, and alternatives. 2. Verifying the patient's decision-making capacity. If capacity is clear, their refusal must be respected. If capacity is questionable, a formal assessment process should be initiated, involving appropriate professionals. 3. Documenting all discussions, assessments, and decisions thoroughly. 4. Seeking consultation with ethics committees or legal counsel when complex ethical or legal issues arise. The ultimate goal is to uphold patient rights while providing appropriate medical care within legal and ethical boundaries. Question 8. Governance review demonstrates that a research team in Alabama is proposing a novel study investigating the efficacy of a new therapeutic agent for a rare genetic disorder. The research question is framed around understanding the cellular mechanisms of the disease, with the potential for significant future therapeutic development. However, the initial protocol submission has raised concerns regarding the clarity of the definition of research subject, as it pertains to individuals who may be incidentally identified through genetic screening of a larger population cohort, and the precise application of the informed consent process for such individuals. Which of the following represents the most appropriate course of action for the research team and the overseeing ethics committee in Alabama? Option A. The research team should proceed with the study as planned, assuming that individuals incidentally identified through genetic screening will be informed if their data is used, as the primary focus is on scientific advancement. Option B. The research team should focus solely on the cellular mechanisms and exclude any consideration of the definition or application of consent for incidentally identified individuals, as this falls outside the core research question. Option C. The ethics committee should approve the protocol with a note suggesting the research team consider clarifying consent procedures later, as the potential scientific benefits are substantial and the identification is incidental. Option D. The research team, in conjunction with the Institutional Review Board, IRB, in Alabama, must meticulously refine the research protocol to clearly define the scope of research subject and the specific procedures for obtaining informed consent from any individual who might be identified, ensuring full compliance with Alabama Bioethics Law and ethical principles. The correct answer is D. The research team, in conjunction with the Institutional Review Board, IRB, in Alabama, must meticulously refine the research protocol to clearly define the scope of research subject and the specific procedures for obtaining informed consent from any individual who might be identified, ensuring full compliance with Alabama Bioethics Law and ethical principles. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between advancing scientific knowledge and upholding the dignity and rights of individuals participating in research. The application of Alabama Bioethics Law requires careful consideration of informed consent, potential risks and benefits, and the ethical treatment of human subjects. The challenge lies in ensuring that the pursuit of scientific advancement does not compromise the fundamental ethical principles enshrined in the law. The correct approach involves a comprehensive review process that prioritizes the protection of human subjects. This entails a thorough evaluation of the research protocol by an Institutional Review Board, IRB, or equivalent ethics committee, ensuring that all aspects of the study, including the definition and application of the research question, adhere strictly to the principles of beneficence, non-maleficence, autonomy, and justice as interpreted under Alabama law. Specifically, the IRB must confirm that the research question is clearly defined, that its potential benefits outweigh the risks, that participants are fully informed and have the capacity to consent, and that vulnerable populations are adequately protected. This aligns with the core tenets of bioethics and the regulatory framework designed to safeguard research participants. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with research based solely on the perceived scientific merit or potential for groundbreaking discovery without rigorous ethical oversight. This fails to acknowledge the legal and ethical obligations to protect research participants. Another incorrect approach is to narrowly interpret the definition of research to exclude certain activities that, while not explicitly labeled as research, still involve human subjects and carry ethical implications. This circumvents the spirit and intent of Alabama Bioethics Law. Finally, an approach that prioritizes the convenience or speed of research over the thoroughness of the informed consent process, or that inadequately assesses participant comprehension, is ethically and legally deficient. Such actions disregard the autonomy of individuals and the legal requirements for valid consent. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a clear understanding of the relevant Alabama Bioethics Law and its ethical underpinnings. This involves proactively identifying potential ethical dilemmas, consulting with ethics committees or legal counsel when necessary, and consistently prioritizing the well-being and rights of research participants throughout the research lifecycle. A commitment to transparency, thorough documentation, and ongoing ethical reflection is crucial for navigating complex bioethical issues. Question 9. Risk assessment procedures indicate that de-identified genetic material collected for a previous study at an Alabama research institution may be valuable for a new, unrelated research project. The original consent form did not explicitly mention future research use. What is the most ethically and legally sound approach for the researchers to proceed in Alabama? Option A. Proceed with the new research using the de-identified material, as de-identification removes all ethical and legal obligations related to consent for secondary use. Option B. Rely on the original consent form, assuming it implicitly covers all future research uses of de-identified biological material. Option C. Seek broad, explicit informed consent from original participants for the future use of their de-identified genetic material in unspecified research, clearly outlining the scope and potential nature of such research. Option D. Obtain consent only after the new research project has been fully designed and the de-identified material has been identified for use. The correct answer is C. Seek broad, explicit informed consent from original participants for the future use of their de-identified genetic material in unspecified research, clearly outlining the scope and potential nature of such research. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between advancing scientific knowledge and upholding individual autonomy and privacy within the specific legal framework of Alabama. The requirement to obtain informed consent for the use of de-identified genetic material, even after initial collection for a different purpose, necessitates careful navigation of Alabama's bioethics laws, particularly concerning patient rights and data stewardship. The professional challenge lies in balancing the potential societal benefits of research with the fundamental rights of individuals whose genetic information is involved. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves proactively seeking explicit, broad consent from participants for future research use of their de-identified genetic material, clearly outlining the scope and nature of potential future studies. This approach is correct because it aligns with the principles of informed consent enshrined in Alabama's bioethics framework, which emphasizes transparency and participant control over their biological data. By obtaining this consent upfront, researchers respect individual autonomy and ensure that the use of de-identified material for new research purposes is ethically and legally sound, preventing potential breaches of trust and legal challenges. This proactive measure respects the spirit and letter of Alabama law regarding research involving human biological materials. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves proceeding with the secondary research using de-identified material without any further consent, relying solely on the initial consent for the original study. This is ethically and legally flawed because the initial consent may not have adequately covered the broad spectrum of future research, and Alabama law requires a robust understanding of how one's biological data will be used. De-identification. While a privacy protection does not negate the ethical obligation to respect the original intent and scope of consent. Another incorrect approach is to assume that de-identification automatically removes all ethical or legal obligations regarding consent for secondary use. While de-identification protects direct identification, the ethical principle of respecting the source of the data and the potential for re-identification, even if remote, or the broader implications of using biological material for unforeseen research still necessitates consideration under Alabama's bioethics guidelines. The law often looks beyond mere de-identification to the underlying consent and ethical stewardship. A further incorrect approach is to seek consent only after the research has been conceived and the de-identified material has been selected for use. This is problematic as it can create a perception of coercion or bias, potentially influencing participant decisions. Furthermore, it may not fully capture the breadth of future research envisioned, and Alabama's bioethics framework encourages a more forward-looking and comprehensive approach to consent for research. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a proactive and transparent approach to informed consent for biobanking and secondary research. This involves developing comprehensive consent forms that clearly articulate the potential uses of biological samples and associated data, including future research. Regular review and updates of consent protocols in light of evolving bioethics laws and best practices in Alabama are crucial. When in doubt, consulting with institutional review boards, and legal counsel specializing in bioethics law in Alabama is paramount to ensure compliance and uphold ethical standards. The decision-making process should prioritize participant autonomy, data integrity, and adherence to the specific regulatory landscape of Alabama. Question 10. In Alabama, a patient with a rare, aggressive form of cancer has a statistically low probability of significant long-term survival with a novel, experimental treatment. The treatment costs $750,000 and is projected to offer a 15% chance of a 2-year survival improvement. If the average life expectancy without the treatment is 6 months, and the treatment is assumed to extend life by an average of 1.5 years for those who respond positively, what is the calculated cost per life year gained for a patient who experiences the benefit of this treatment? Option A. $1,000,000 per life year gained, calculated as the total treatment cost divided by the average life expectancy without treatment. Option B. $500,000 per life year gained, calculated as the total treatment cost divided by the average life extension for responders. Option C. $750,000 per life year gained, calculated as the total treatment cost divided by the average life extension for responders. Option D. $1,500,000 per life year gained, calculated as the total treatment cost divided by the projected survival improvement for all patients. The correct answer is B. $500,000 per life year gained, calculated as the total treatment cost divided by the average life extension for responders. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the principle of non-maleficence with the practical realities of resource allocation and the potential for patient benefit. The core ethical dilemma lies in determining the acceptable level of risk and resource expenditure when a treatment offers a statistically marginal but potentially life-saving benefit to a patient with a rare condition. Careful judgment is required to avoid both imposing undue harm through aggressive, costly, and potentially ineffective treatment, and conversely, withholding potentially beneficial treatment due to overly conservative resource management. The best professional approach involves a comprehensive assessment of the patient's individual circumstances, the scientific evidence for the treatment's efficacy in similar cases, and a transparent discussion with the patient and their family about the risks, benefits, and costs. This includes calculating the number needed to treat, NNT, to achieve a specific positive outcome, such as a 1-year survival improvement, and comparing this to the cost per life year gained. For instance, if a treatment costs $500,000 and is projected to extend life by 0.5 years for a patient with a 10% chance of significant benefit, the cost per life year gain would be $500,000 5 years equals $1,000,000/text year /. If the NNT to achieve a significant benefit is 20, meaning 20 patients must be treated for one to experience the benefit, and the cost per patient is $500,000, the total cost for one benefit is $20 times $500,000 equals $10,000,000. This approach aligns with Alabama's bioethics guidelines by prioritizing patient well-being and avoiding futile or excessively burdensome treatments, while also acknowledging the responsible stewardship of healthcare resources. The decision is data-driven and patient-centered, ensuring that interventions are not only potentially beneficial, but also proportionate to the expected outcomes. An approach that focuses solely on the statistical probability of success, without considering the individual patient's quality of life or the potential for adverse events, fails to uphold non-maleficence. For example, proceeding with a treatment that has a 95% chance of severe side effects, even if it offers a 5% chance of a cure, would likely cause more harm than good. This disregards the ethical imperative to do no harm. Another unacceptable approach is to deny treatment solely based on the high cost, without a thorough analysis of the potential benefit and the patient's individual prognosis. Alabama law emphasizes that treatment decisions should not be arbitrary and must be based on sound medical judgment and ethical considerations. Simply stating that the treatment is too expensive without quantifying the value proposition, e.g., cost per life year gained, is a failure to engage in responsible ethical decision-making. A third incorrect approach would be to recommend the most aggressive and expensive treatment option, regardless of the evidence of efficacy or the patient's wishes. This could lead to significant harm through unnecessary procedures, side effects, and financial burden, violating the principle of non-maleficence and potentially disrespecting patient autonomy. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured ethical framework. This includes 1. Identifying the ethical principles at play: non-maleficence, beneficence, autonomy, justice. 2. Gathering all relevant information: medical history, diagnostic data, treatment efficacy data, cost information. 3. Consulting with relevant experts, specialists, ethicists. 4. Engaging in open and honest communication with the patient and their family. And 5. Making a decision that is ethically justifiable, medically sound, and respects the patient's values and preferences, while also considering resource limitations. Question 11. Operational review demonstrates that a patient scheduled for a complex surgical procedure at a hospital in Birmingham, Alabama, primarily speaks Spanish and has limited English proficiency. The surgical team has prepared all necessary documentation in English. What is the most appropriate course of action to ensure legal and ethical informed consent is obtained? Option A. Ask the patient's adult son, who is present and speaks both languages, to translate the informed consent documents and explanations for his father. Option B. Provide the patient with the English informed consent documents and a brief verbal explanation in English, assuming he will understand due to his nodding. Option C. Engage a qualified medical interpreter fluent in both English and Spanish to explain the procedure, its risks, benefits, and alternatives to the patient, and to answer any questions. Option D. Utilize a readily available translation app on a mobile device to convey the essential information about the surgery to the patient. Correct answer is C. Engage a qualified medical interpreter fluent in both English and Spanish to explain the procedure, its risks, benefits, and alternatives to the patient, and to answer any questions. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the patient's right to autonomy with the healthcare provider's duty to ensure understanding and voluntariness in medical decision-making, particularly when a language barrier exists. Alabama law, specifically the Alabama Informed Consent Act, mandates that patients receive sufficient information to make an informed decision. This includes understanding the nature of the procedure, its risks and benefits, and alternatives. When a patient's primary language is not English, the provider has a heightened responsibility to ensure comprehension. The correct approach involves utilizing a qualified medical interpreter to facilitate communication. This ensures that the patient receives the information in a language they fully understand, allowing for genuine comprehension of the procedure, its implications, and their right to refuse. This aligns with the ethical principles of beneficence, non-maleficence, and respect for patient autonomy, as well as the legal requirements of the Alabama Informed Consent Act, which implicitly requires effective communication for consent to be truly informed. An incorrect approach would be to rely on a family member to translate. While well-intentioned, family members may not possess the medical vocabulary necessary for accurate translation, may omit or alter information due to personal biases or emotional involvement, or may feel pressured to influence the patient's decision. This fails to meet the legal standard for informed consent, as it does not guarantee the patient's full and accurate understanding. Another incorrect approach is to proceed with the procedure after a brief, superficial explanation in English, assuming the patient understands due to nodding or minimal verbal responses. This disregards the potential for misunderstanding and violates the patient's right to make a truly informed choice, contravening the spirit and letter of the Alabama Informed Consent Act. Finally, using a translation app without verification by a human interpreter is also inadequate. While these tools can offer basic translations, they often lack nuance, medical accuracy, and the ability to gauge patient comprehension or address follow-up questions effectively. thus failing to establish legally sound, informed consent. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes clear, accurate, and comprehensible communication. This involves proactively identifying language barriers, utilizing appropriate resources like qualified interpreters, and verifying patient understanding through open-ended questions and observation, ensuring that all legal and ethical obligations regarding informed consent are met. Question 12. Compliance review shows a physician in Birmingham, Alabama, is treating a patient who has refused a medically recommended procedure. The patient's family is strongly advocating for the procedure, stating the patient is not thinking clearly. The physician is concerned about the patient's well-being, but also recognizes the patient's right to refuse treatment. Which of the following actions best upholds the principles of informed consent under Alabama law? Option A. Inform the patient that their family believes they are not thinking clearly and that the procedure will be performed regardless of their wishes to ensure their safety. Option B. Engage in a detailed discussion with the patient about the procedure, its risks, benefits, and alternatives, while simultaneously assessing their capacity to understand this information and make a decision, and exploring any factors that might be influencing their refusal. Option C. Withhold detailed information about the risks and benefits of the procedure from the patient, focusing only on the positive outcomes to encourage them to accept the treatment, given the family's concerns. Option D. Proceed with the procedure as recommended by the medical team, as the patient's family has indicated the patient is not thinking clearly and the family's wishes should take precedence. The correct answer is B. Engage in a detailed discussion with the patient about the procedure, its risks, benefits, and alternatives, while simultaneously assessing their capacity to understand this information and make a decision, and exploring any factors that might be influencing their refusal. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a healthcare provider in Alabama to navigate the delicate balance between respecting a patient's autonomy and ensuring they receive medically necessary treatment, particularly when the patient's decision-making capacity is in question due to a potentially reversible condition. The provider must act ethically and legally, adhering to Alabama's informed consent requirements, while also considering the patient's best interests and the potential for coercion or undue influence. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a multifaceted approach that prioritizes obtaining informed consent directly from the patient while simultaneously assessing their capacity and exploring the underlying reasons for their refusal. This includes clearly explaining the proposed treatment, its risks, benefits, and alternatives in understandable terms, and patiently answering all questions. Crucially, it involves a thorough assessment of the patient's decision-making capacity, recognizing that capacity can fluctuate and may be influenced by factors like pain, medication side effects, or psychological distress. If capacity is questionable, the provider should explore reversible causes and seek to re-establish it. If the patient demonstrates capacity and still refuses, the provider must respect that decision, documenting the process meticulously. This aligns with Alabama's emphasis on patient autonomy and the requirement for informed consent, which presumes a capable patient has the right to refuse treatment, even if that refusal seems medically inadvisable. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves proceeding with the treatment without obtaining the patient's consent, solely based on the family's insistence. This directly violates the core principle of informed consent, which is a patient-specific right. Alabama law requires consent from the patient themselves, not their family, unless the patient lacks capacity and a legally authorized surrogate is involved. Proceeding without consent is a form of battery. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the patient's refusal as simply being difficult or uncooperative without a thorough assessment of their capacity and the reasons behind their decision. This fails to uphold the ethical obligation to understand the patient's perspective and to ensure their refusal is truly informed and voluntary. It bypasses the crucial step of exploring reversible factors that might be impairing their judgment or their ability to comprehend the information provided. A third incorrect approach is to pressure the patient into accepting the treatment by withholding information about alternatives or by exaggerating the risks of refusal. This constitutes coercion and undermines the voluntariness aspect of informed consent. Alabama law mandates that patients receive all relevant information to make a free and informed choice, free from duress or manipulation. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a structured decision-making process when faced with a patient's refusal of treatment. This process begins with a clear and comprehensive explanation of the proposed treatment, its risks, benefits, and alternatives, tailored to the patient's understanding. Simultaneously, a robust assessment of the patient's decision-making capacity must be conducted, looking for any reversible factors that might be impairing their judgment. If capacity is present and the refusal is informed and voluntary, that decision must be respected. If capacity is questionable, efforts should be made to restore it. Throughout this process, open communication, empathy, and meticulous documentation are paramount. When in doubt, consulting with ethics committees or legal counsel is advisable. Question 13. Strategic planning requires a healthcare provider in Alabama to consider the ethical and legal implications of patient consent, particularly in emergent situations. If a patient arrives at the emergency department in a comatose state following a severe accident and requires immediate surgery to prevent death, what is the most appropriate course of action regarding informed consent? Option A. Proceed with the necessary life-saving surgery without obtaining explicit informed consent from the patient, as the emergency renders them incapable of consenting and immediate intervention is required to preserve life. Option B. Document the patient's inability to consent and postpone all surgical intervention until the patient regains consciousness and can provide consent. Option C. Delay the life-saving surgery until a distant family member can be contacted and provide consent, given the patient's critical condition. Option D. Perform the surgery and then attempt to obtain retrospective consent from the patient once they have recovered, without first establishing the immediate necessity for life-saving intervention. The correct answer is A. Proceed with the necessary life-saving surgery without obtaining explicit informed consent from the patient, as the emergency renders them incapable of consenting and immediate intervention is required to preserve life. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professionally challenging situation because it involves a patient who is unable to provide informed consent due to a sudden, severe medical emergency. The healthcare provider must balance the urgent need to provide life-saving treatment with the fundamental ethical and legal requirement of obtaining informed consent. Failure to act promptly could result in irreversible harm or death, while proceeding without appropriate authorization, where possible, could violate patient autonomy and legal standards. The challenge lies in navigating the narrow exceptions to informed consent in Alabama law, while ensuring patient well-being and upholding ethical principles. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice in this situation is to proceed with the necessary emergency medical treatment without obtaining explicit informed consent from the patient, as the patient's condition renders them incapable of providing it, and the treatment is immediately necessary to preserve life or prevent serious harm. Alabama law, consistent with general bioethical principles, recognizes an exception to informed consent in emergency situations where a patient is unconscious, incapacitated, or otherwise unable to consent, and immediate treatment is required to prevent death or serious bodily harm. This approach prioritizes the patient's immediate safety and well-being, which is the paramount ethical and legal consideration when consent cannot be obtained. Incorrect approach is analysis. Proceeding with treatment only after attempting to contact a distant family member, when the patient's condition is critical and time is of the essence, is an ethically and legally flawed approach. While family involvement is generally preferred, delaying life-saving intervention for such a reason in an emergency situation where the patient is incapacitated would violate the principle of beneficence and could lead to a worse outcome for the patient. This approach fails to recognize the urgency dictated by the patient's immediate medical state. Another incorrect approach is to document the patient's inability to consent and defer all treatment until the patient regains consciousness, even if the condition is life-threatening. This directly contravenes the emergency exception to informed consent and could result in preventable death or severe disability, failing the duty of care owed to the patient. Finally, proceeding with treatment and then seeking retrospective consent from the patient after they have recovered, without clear evidence that the treatment was immediately necessary to prevent death or serious harm, could be problematic. While some retrospective consent might be considered in specific post-emergency scenarios, the primary justification for bypassing initial consent must be the immediate life-saving necessity, not a later attempt to legitimize the action. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such dilemmas should first rapidly assess the patient's capacity to consent. If capacity is absent, and the situation is a true medical emergency where delay would cause significant harm or death, the emergency exception to informed consent, as recognized under Alabama law, should be invoked. Documentation of the patient's condition, the assessment of incapacity, the rationale for invoking the emergency exception, and the treatment provided is crucial. The focus should always be on the patient's best interests and the immediate preservation of life and health when informed consent cannot be obtained. Question 14. Operational review demonstrates that a patient in an Alabama hospital experiencing a sudden and severe medical event is exhibiting signs of confusion and difficulty processing complex information. The physician believes a critical surgical intervention is immediately necessary to save the patient's life. The patient verbally agrees to the procedure when asked, but their responses suggest a limited grasp of the details of the surgery, its risks, and alternatives. What is the most ethically and legally sound approach for the physician to take in Alabama? Option A. Delay the surgery until the patient's mental state improves significantly, even if this poses a substantial risk to their life, to ensure perfect understanding of all details. Option B. Thoroughly assess the patient's capacity to understand the information, utilizing simplified language, visual aids, and patient questioning to ensure comprehension. If capacity remains questionable, immediately involve the patient's legally recognized surrogate decision-maker to obtain informed consent, documenting all steps taken. Option C. Proceed with the surgery based on the patient's verbal assent, as the situation is life-threatening and time is of the essence, assuming the patient implicitly understands the necessity. Option D. Obtain consent from the patient's sibling, who is present and expresses strong support for the surgery, even though they are not the designated legal healthcare proxy. The correct answer is B. Thoroughly assess the patient's capacity to understand the information, utilizing simplified language, visual aids, and patient questioning to ensure comprehension. If capacity remains questionable, immediately involve the patient's legally recognized surrogate decision-maker to obtain informed consent, documenting all steps taken. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent vulnerability of the patient and the critical nature of obtaining truly informed consent, especially when a patient's capacity to understand complex medical information is compromised. The physician must balance the urgency of a potentially life-saving procedure with the ethical and legal imperative to respect patient autonomy, which is predicated on understanding. Careful judgment is required to ensure that consent, if obtained, is not merely a procedural formality, but a genuine reflection of the patient's wishes, informed by adequate comprehension. Best professional practice involves a multifaceted approach that prioritizes assessing and supporting the patient's decision-making capacity. This includes employing clear, simple language, utilizing visual aids, and patiently answering all questions to ensure comprehension. Crucially, it necessitates engaging a surrogate decision-maker when the patient's capacity is questionable, ensuring that the surrogate understands their role and the patient's known wishes or best interests. This approach aligns with Alabama's informed consent statutes and bioethical principles that emphasize patient autonomy and the protection of vulnerable individuals. The Alabama Code, particularly concerning patient rights and consent for medical treatment, mandates that patients have the right to make informed decisions about their care, and healthcare providers have a duty to facilitate this understanding. When capacity is in doubt, the law and ethical guidelines strongly support the involvement of a legally recognized surrogate. An approach that proceeds with the procedure based solely on the patient's assent without a thorough assessment of their understanding, or the involvement of a surrogate when capacity is compromised, is ethically and legally deficient. This fails to uphold the principle of autonomy, as consent cannot be truly informed if the patient does not comprehend the risks, benefits, and alternatives. It also risks violating Alabama law, which requires that consent be informed, and in cases of diminished capacity, obtained from an appropriate surrogate. Another unacceptable approach is to delay the procedure indefinitely due to minor communication barriers, without exploring all reasonable means to facilitate understanding or involve a surrogate. While thoroughness is important, an undue delay in a situation requiring urgent intervention can be detrimental to the patient's well-being and may not align with the patient's presumed best interests, especially if the patient has previously expressed a desire for such treatment. Finally, proceeding with the procedure after obtaining consent from a family member who is not the legally designated surrogate, without proper legal authorization or a clear understanding of the patient's wishes is also professionally unacceptable. This bypasses established legal frameworks for surrogate decision-making and undermines the patient's right to have their wishes respected, even if they are unable to express them directly. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a comprehensive assessment of the patient's capacity to understand the information presented. If capacity is present, the focus is on ensuring comprehension through clear communication. If capacity is questionable, the framework dictates engaging a qualified surrogate decision-maker, following established legal and ethical protocols for identifying and involving them. Throughout this process, documentation of the assessment, communication, and consent obtained is paramount. Question 15. Operational review demonstrates that a competent adult patient in an Alabama hospital, diagnosed with a treatable but serious condition, has repeatedly refused a recommended life-saving treatment, stating a preference for palliative care. The healthcare provider believes this refusal is not in the patient's best interest and that the patient is making a grave error in judgment. Which of the following represents the most appropriate course of action for the healthcare provider under Alabama Bioethics Law? Option A. Inform the patient's family of the patient's refusal and seek their consent to proceed with the treatment, bypassing further assessment of the patient's capacity. Option B. Immediately proceed with the recommended life-saving treatment, overriding the patient's refusal, based on the provider's professional judgment that it is in the patient's best interest. Option C. Document the patient's refusal and immediately withdraw all medical interventions, assuming the patient wishes to forego all care. Option D. Conduct a thorough assessment to determine the patient's decision-making capacity, ensuring they understand the condition, treatment options, risks, benefits, and alternatives, and if capacity is present, respect their informed refusal. The correct answer is D. Conduct a thorough assessment to determine the patient's decision-making capacity, ensuring they understand the condition, treatment options, risks, benefits, and alternatives, and if capacity is present, respect their informed refusal. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a patient's expressed wishes and the healthcare provider's ethical and legal obligations to act in the patient's best interest, particularly when the patient's capacity to make informed decisions is in question. Navigating this requires a delicate balance of respecting patient autonomy while upholding the duty of care, all within the framework of Alabama law. The best professional approach involves a systematic assessment of the patient's decision-making capacity. This means engaging in a thorough evaluation to determine if the patient understands the nature of their condition, the proposed treatment, the risks and benefits of that treatment, and the alternatives, including the option of no treatment. If the patient is deemed to have capacity, their informed refusal of treatment must be respected, even if the provider disagrees with the decision. This aligns with the fundamental ethical principle of patient autonomy and is supported by Alabama's informed consent statutes, which emphasize a patient's right to make decisions about their own medical care. The provider's role is to ensure the patient is fully informed and capable of making such a decision. An approach that immediately overrides the patient's stated wishes based solely on the provider's judgment of what is best fails to uphold the principle of patient autonomy. Alabama law requires a demonstration of incapacity before a provider can legally disregard a patient's directives. Simply believing a treatment is beneficial does not grant the provider the authority to impose it against the patient's will if the patient possesses decision-making capacity. Another unacceptable approach is to proceed with treatment without a clear and documented assessment of the patient's capacity, especially when the patient has expressed dissent. This bypasses the crucial step of ensuring informed consent and could lead to a violation of the patient's rights. The absence of a formal capacity evaluation leaves the provider vulnerable to legal challenges and ethical criticism for failing to adhere to established protocols. Finally, deferring the decision entirely to family members without a proper assessment of the patient's capacity or a clear legal directive, like a durable power of attorney for healthcare, is also professionally unsound. While family input can be valuable, the primary decision maker, if capable, is the patient. If the patient lacks capacity, Alabama law outlines specific procedures for surrogate decision-making, which must be followed. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should begin with a presumption of capacity. The provider must then conduct a comprehensive assessment of the patient's understanding and voluntariness. If capacity is confirmed, the patient's informed decisions, even if contrary to the provider's recommendation, must be respected. If capacity is questionable, a formal capacity evaluation should be initiated, and if incapacity is determined, the appropriate legal and ethical pathways for surrogate decision-making or intervention must be followed, always prioritizing the patient's best interests as defined by law and ethical guidelines. Question 16. Operational review demonstrates that a physician in Alabama is caring for a terminally ill patient who has clearly expressed a desire to refuse further life-sustaining treatment. The patient's family, however, is strongly opposed to this decision, citing religious objections and a belief that the patient is not fully comprehending the implications of their choice. The physician is experiencing moral distress, torn between respecting the patient's autonomy and the family's fervent pleas. Which of the following represents the most ethically and legally sound course of action for the physician to take in Alabama? Option A. Initiate a formal consultation with the hospital's ethics committee to review the case, assess the patient's capacity for decision-making, and ensure all actions align with Alabama Bioethics Law and established ethical guidelines, while continuing to communicate empathetically with both the patient and the family. Option B. Proceed with the family's wishes to continue life-sustaining treatment, overriding the patient's expressed desire due to the family's strong religious convictions and the physician's own discomfort with the situation. Option C. Inform the family that the physician cannot proceed with the patient's wishes due to their objections and suggest the family seek legal counsel to challenge the patient's decision. Option D. Immediately withdraw life-sustaining treatment, as per the patient's request without further consultation, assuming the patient's initial expression of desire is sufficient and the family's objections are secondary. The correct answer is A. Initiate a formal consultation with the hospital's ethics committee to review the case, assess the patient's capacity for decision-making, and ensure all actions align with Alabama Bioethics Law and established ethical guidelines, while continuing to communicate empathetically with both the patient and the family. Explanation. This scenario presents a significant professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between patient autonomy and the physician's duty to provide care, complicated by the potential for harm and the legal framework governing end-of-life decisions in Alabama. The physician must navigate deeply personal beliefs, family dynamics, and the legal and ethical obligations to both the patient and the state. The core of the challenge lies in respecting the patient's expressed wishes while ensuring that those wishes are informed and that the physician's actions align with Alabama law and bioethical principles. Best approach involves a structured, multifaceted ethical decision-making process that prioritizes informed consent and legal compliance. This approach begins with a thorough assessment of the patient's capacity to make decisions, followed by open and empathetic communication with the patient and their family. It necessitates consulting with the hospital's ethics committee, which is a critical resource for navigating complex bioethical dilemmas within Alabama's healthcare system. This committee can provide guidance on Alabama bioethics law, ensuring that all actions taken are legally sound and ethically defensible, particularly concerning the withdrawal of life-sustaining treatment. The process emphasizes documentation of all discussions and decisions, creating a clear record of the ethical and legal considerations addressed. An incorrect approach would be to unilaterally make a decision based solely on the physician's personal moral or religious beliefs, disregarding the patient's expressed wishes or the established legal framework in Alabama. This fails to uphold the principle of patient autonomy and could lead to legal repercussions and ethical censure for violating the patient's right to self-determination. Another incorrect approach would be to proceed with the family's wishes without a thorough and independent assessment of the patient's capacity and a clear understanding of the patient's own directives. While family input is important, the patient's autonomy, if they possess decision-making capacity, is paramount. Failing to confirm capacity and directly engage the patient where possible undermines their fundamental rights. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to delay or avoid involving the ethics committee, attempting to resolve the complex issue solely within the physician-patient relationship without seeking broader institutional and ethical expertise. This bypasses a crucial safeguard designed to ensure that decisions are made in accordance with established bioethical principles and Alabama law, potentially exposing the physician and the institution to significant risk. Professionals should employ a systematic decision-making framework that includes 1. Assessing patient capacity. 2. Engaging in open and honest communication with the patient and family. 3. Consulting with the Hospital Ethics Committee for guidance on legal and ethical obligations under Alabama Bioethics Law. 4. Documenting all assessments, discussions, and decisions thoroughly. 5. Adhering strictly to the patient's informed decisions, provided they have capacity and are consistent with legal and ethical standards. Question 17. The assessment process reveals that a couple residing in Alabama wishes to pursue surrogacy due to infertility. They have identified a potential surrogate who is also an Alabama resident. The couple has drafted a document outlining the financial compensation and the surrogate's agreement to relinquish parental rights, but they have not yet consulted with independent legal counsel, nor has the surrogate. The couple is eager to proceed with the embryo transfer as soon as possible. Considering Alabama's legal framework for surrogacy and assisted reproductive technologies, what is the most prudent and legally compliant course of action for the intended parents and the surrogate? Option A. Rely on the drafted document as sufficient, assuming that a verbal agreement and the surrogate's willingness to carry the child are enough to establish parental rights in Alabama. Option B. Proceed with the embryo transfer based on the drafted document, with the understanding that legal counsel will be sought after the birth to finalize parentage. Option C. Engage independent legal counsel for both the intended parents and the surrogate to draft and review a comprehensive surrogacy agreement that complies with Alabama law, ensuring all parties understand their rights and responsibilities before proceeding with any medical procedures. Option D. Have the surrogate sign the drafted document immediately and proceed with the embryo transfer, with the intention of the intended parents adopting the child after birth to secure legal parentage. The correct answer is C. Engage independent legal counsel for both the intended parents and the surrogate to draft and review a comprehensive surrogacy agreement that complies with Alabama law, ensuring all parties understand their rights and responsibilities before proceeding with any medical procedures. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it involves navigating the complex legal and ethical landscape of surrogacy in Alabama, particularly concerning the rights and well-being of all parties involved, including the surrogate, the intended parents, and the child. Alabama law, while permitting surrogacy, imposes specific requirements and considerations that must be meticulously followed to ensure the arrangement is legally sound and ethically responsible. The primary challenge lies in balancing the contractual nature of surrogacy with the inherent human and emotional aspects, ensuring that no party is exploited and that the child's best interests are paramount. The best professional approach involves a comprehensive legal agreement drafted and reviewed by independent legal counsel for both the intended parents and the surrogate, in strict adherence to Alabama's Parentage Act and any relevant case law concerning assisted reproductive technologies. This agreement must clearly outline all terms, including compensation, medical decisions, parental rights, and responsibilities, and be executed prior to the embryo transfer. This approach is correct because it provides a robust legal framework that protects all parties, clarifies expectations, and aligns with Alabama's statutory requirements for establishing parentage in surrogacy arrangements, thereby minimizing potential disputes and ensuring the legal recognition of the intended parent's rights. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the surrogacy arrangement based solely on a verbal agreement or a loosely drafted document that does not fully address all legal and ethical considerations mandated by Alabama law. This failure to establish a comprehensive, legally binding contract reviewed by independent counsel significantly jeopardizes the legal standing of the intended parent's claim to parentage and leaves the surrogate vulnerable. It directly contravenes the spirit and letter of Alabama's laws designed to protect all parties in such arrangements. Another incorrect approach would be to prioritize the financial aspects of the surrogacy agreement over the surrogate's informed consent and well-being, or to fail to ensure the surrogate has access to independent legal and psychological support. This ethically compromises the arrangement by potentially exploiting the surrogate and failing to adequately safeguard her autonomy and health. Alabama law and bioethical principles emphasize the importance of voluntary and informed consent, as well as the physical and emotional health of the surrogate. A third incorrect approach would be to bypass the legal requirements for establishing parentage in Alabama, such as failing to file the necessary pre-birth orders or post-birth acknowledgments of parentage. This oversight can lead to significant legal complications regarding the child's citizenship, inheritance, and the legal recognition of the intended parents as the child's lawful parents, creating immense distress and uncertainty for the family. Professionals should employ a decision-making process that begins with a thorough understanding of Alabama's specific surrogacy laws and bioethical guidelines. This involves prioritizing the creation of a legally sound and ethically robust contract, ensuring independent legal representation for all parties, and confirming that all parties provide fully informed consent. The process must also include provisions for the surrogate's medical and psychological well-being throughout the pregnancy and birth, and a clear plan for establishing legal parentage post-birth, always with the child's best interests as the guiding principle. Question 18. The performance metrics show a significant increase in demand for a specialized, life-sustaining treatment within a rural Alabama hospital, exceeding the current available supply. A patient with a chronic, progressive condition that has recently worsened requires immediate access to this treatment to prevent irreversible decline, while another patient, a prominent community leader with a newly diagnosed, acute but potentially reversible condition, also requires the same treatment urgently. The hospital's bioethics committee has not yet finalized updated guidelines for this specific scarcity scenario. Which of the following actions best reflects adherence to Alabama Bioethics Law and professional ethical obligations in this situation? Option A. The hospital's medical team, in consultation with the ethics committee chair, prioritizes the patient with the chronic, progressive condition based on the established clinical urgency and the potential for irreversible harm if treatment is delayed, while initiating a formal review process for the other patient's needs once the immediate crisis is managed. Option B. The hospital administration prioritizes the community leader due to their influential position and potential to secure future funding for the hospital, ensuring their immediate access to the treatment. Option C. The hospital delays any allocation decision until a comprehensive, institution-wide policy for all potential scarcity scenarios is fully ratified by the board, even if it means delaying treatment for both patients. Option D. The attending physician for the community leader, who has a personal relationship with the patient, unilaterally allocates the treatment to them based on their assessment of the patient's overall importance to the community. The correct answer is A. The hospital's medical team, in consultation with the ethics committee chair, prioritizes the patient with the chronic, progressive condition based on the established clinical urgency and the potential for irreversible harm if treatment is delayed, while initiating a formal review process for the other patient's needs once the immediate crisis is managed. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it pits the immediate needs of a patient against the established protocols for resource allocation within a healthcare institution, particularly in the context of limited availability. The ethical imperative to provide care must be balanced with the principles of justice and fairness in distributing scarce resources, ensuring that decisions are not arbitrary or discriminatory. Alabama Bioethics Law requires that access to healthcare resources be equitable and based on objective criteria, avoiding bias. The best approach involves a transparent and documented process that prioritizes patients based on established clinical criteria and the urgency of their medical need, as determined by a multidisciplinary team. This aligns with the ethical principle of distributive justice, ensuring that resources are allocated fairly and efficiently to those who will benefit most. Alabama law emphasizes the importance of clear policies and procedures for resource allocation during times of scarcity, and adherence to these protocols protects both the patient and the institution from ethical and legal challenges. This approach ensures that decisions are defensible and grounded in medical necessity rather than personal bias or external pressures. An approach that prioritizes a patient solely based on their social status or perceived ability to pay, without regard to clinical need, violates the principle of justice and potentially Alabama's bioethics guidelines concerning equitable access to care. Such a decision could be seen as discriminatory and undermines the trust placed in healthcare providers. Another incorrect approach would be to delay allocation decisions indefinitely, hoping that the resource becomes available without a structured plan. This inaction can lead to patient harm and fails to uphold the institution's responsibility to manage its resources effectively and ethically. It also neglects the legal and ethical obligation to make timely decisions based on available information and established protocols. Finally, an approach that relies on the subjective opinion of a single individual without a defined process or oversight risks introducing bias and inconsistency. Alabama's bioethics framework encourages collaborative decision-making and adherence to established guidelines to ensure objectivity and accountability in resource allocation. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the available resources and the established institutional policies for their allocation. This should be followed by a thorough assessment of patient needs using objective clinical criteria, engaging a multidisciplinary team in the decision-making process, documenting all deliberations and decisions, and ensuring transparency with patients and their families are crucial steps in navigating these complex ethical dilemmas. Question 19. The audit findings indicate that a local law enforcement agency in Alabama has submitted a written request for specific patient information related to an ongoing criminal investigation. The request is detailed and outlines the information needed, but it does not include a court order, subpoena, or warrant. The healthcare organization's privacy officer is unsure whether to release the information, citing HIPAA concerns. Which of the following actions best represents the appropriate response under Alabama's healthcare privacy regulations, which are governed by federal HIPAA laws? Option A. Contact the patient to obtain their written authorization before releasing any information to the law enforcement agency. Option B. Refuse to release any patient information, stating that HIPAA prohibits disclosure without a court order, subpoena, or warrant. Option C. Review the law enforcement request against the specific provisions of the HIPAA privacy rule for disclosures related to law enforcement purposes, verifying if the request meets the criteria for disclosure without patient authorization, and document the decision. Option D. Immediately release all requested patient information to the law enforcement agency to avoid any potential obstruction of justice. The correct answer is C. Review the law enforcement request against the specific provisions of the HIPAA privacy rule for disclosures related to law enforcement purposes, verifying if the request meets the criteria for disclosure without patient authorization, and document the decision. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between a healthcare provider's duty to protect patient privacy under HIPAA and the need to respond to a potentially urgent request from a law enforcement agency. Navigating this requires a precise understanding of HIPAA disclosure provisions and the specific circumstances under which protected health information, FI, can be shared without patient authorization. Careful judgment is essential to avoid both privacy breaches and obstruction of justice. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the law enforcement's request against the specific provisions of the HIPAA privacy rule concerning disclosures for law enforcement purposes. This means verifying that the request meets the criteria outlined in 45 CFR Section 164, 512, F, which permits disclosures without patient authorization under certain conditions, such as when the request is in writing, specifies the information needed, and meets one of the enumerated exceptions E, G, for identification, locating a suspect, or providing information about a victim. The covered entity must document the request and the basis for the disclosure. This approach is correct because it directly adheres to the regulatory framework established by HIPAA, ensuring that any disclosure is legally permissible and minimizes the risk of a privacy violation. It prioritizes compliance with federal law while acknowledging legitimate law enforcement needs. An incorrect approach would be to immediately provide all requested information without verifying the legal basis for the disclosure. This fails to comply with HIPAA requirement to limit disclosures to the minimum necessary, and could result in an unauthorized disclosure of PHI, leading to potential penalties and erosion of patient trust. Another incorrect approach would be to refuse to provide any information, citing HIPAA, without first assessing whether the request falls under a permissible disclosure exception. While patient privacy is paramount, HIPAA does not create an absolute barrier to all law enforcement requests. A blanket refusal without proper evaluation could hinder a legitimate investigation and potentially have legal repercussions for the covered entity. A further incorrect approach would be to contact the patient to obtain authorization before responding to the law enforcement request. While obtaining patient authorization is the most common method for disclosure. It is not required when the request meets specific law enforcement exceptions under HIPAA. Delaying the response to seek authorization could impede the law enforcement investigation and is not mandated by the regulation in this context. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve 1. Understanding the nature of the request and the requesting entity. 2. Consulting the relevant sections of the HIPAA privacy rule, specifically 45 CFR Section 164, 512, to determine if any exceptions apply. 3. If an exception appears applicable, carefully reviewing the request to ensure it meets all the specific criteria of that exception. 4. Documenting the request, the assessment, and the decision to disclose or not disclose. 5. If unsure, consulting with the organization's privacy officer or legal counsel. Question 20. Cost-benefit analysis shows that a novel gene therapy developed in Alabama has the potential to generate $750 million in global revenue over its life cycle. However, implementing the therapy in accordance with the principles of the Declaration of Helsinki and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, LawConquer, regarding informed consent and non-discrimination, would incur an additional $100 million in research, development, and regulatory compliance costs. If the company chooses to bypass these international ethical standards to expedite market entry and reduce initial costs, there is a 30% probability of facing international sanctions that would reduce the total global revenue by 40%. Assuming a discount rate of 10% for future cash flows, what is the expected net present value, NPV, of proceeding with full international ethical compliance versus the expected NPV of bypassing these standards? Option A. Proceeding with full international ethical compliance yields an expected NPV of $675 million, while bypassing these standards yields an expected NPV of $315 million. Option B. Proceeding with full international ethical compliance yields an expected NPV of $575 million, while bypassing these standards yields an expected NPV of $315 million. Option C. Proceeding with full international ethical compliance yields an expected NPV of $675 million, while bypassing these standards yields an expected NPV of $750 million. Option D. Proceeding with full international ethical compliance yields an expected NPV of $575 million, while bypassing these standards yields an expected NPV of $450 million. The correct answer is B. Proceeding with full international ethical compliance yields an expected NPV of $575 million, while bypassing these standards yields an expected NPV of $315 million. Explanation. 1. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge by requiring a financial assessment of a bioethical decision, specifically concerning the potential for a novel gene therapy to be adopted internationally. The challenge lies in quantifying the potential benefits and costs of adhering to or deviating from international bioethics treaties, particularly when faced with differing national regulatory environments and the potential for significant economic gains or losses. The Alabama Bioethics Law exam context necessitates grounding the analysis within the framework of Alabama's regulatory landscape, while acknowledging the influence of international agreements. 2. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves a comprehensive cost-benefit analysis that explicitly incorporates the financial implications of adhering to the principles outlined in the Declaration of Helsinki and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, LawConquer, as they relate to human dignity and non-discrimination in medical research and treatment. This approach quantifies the potential long-term economic benefits of maintaining international goodwill, avoiding sanctions, and facilitating future global collaborations, alongside the direct costs of compliance with these treaties. It also accounts for the potential economic risks associated with non-compliance, such as reputational damage and exclusion from international markets. The calculation would involve estimating the present value of future revenue streams from the gene therapy, discounted by a rate that reflects the risk of international regulatory hurdles or outright bans due to ethical non-compliance. For example, if the projected net present value, NPV, of the gene therapy's global market is $500 million, and the risk of international sanctions due to non-adherence to the Declaration of Helsinki is estimated to reduce this NPV by 20%. The adjusted NPV would be $400 million. The cost of compliance, including ethical review board fees, additional clinical trial phases to meet international standards, and legal counsel, might be $50 million. The net benefit of compliance is then calculated as the adjusted NPV minus the cost of compliance. 3. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to solely focus on the immediate financial gains of rapid market entry in Alabama, disregarding the potential long-term economic repercussions of violating international bioethics treaties. This approach fails to account for the interconnectedness of global health and commerce. For instance, if a company prioritizes maximizing short-term profits by circumventing international ethical guidelines, they might face significant penalties, market boycotts, and exclusion from lucrative international markets, leading to a net financial loss far exceeding any initial gains. This ignores the economic principle of long-term value creation. Another incorrect approach would be to conduct a cost-benefit analysis that only considers direct financial costs and benefits, without factoring in the intangible but significant economic impacts of ethical reputation and international standing. For example, a company might calculate the direct costs of research and development and the projected sales revenue, but fail to quantify the economic damage of being perceived as unethical on a global scale. This could manifest as difficulty attracting international investment, loss of skilled personnel, and increased scrutiny from regulatory bodies worldwide, all of which have substantial, albeit harder to quantify, economic consequences. 4. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a holistic and forward-thinking approach to bioethical decision-making that integrates financial considerations with ethical obligations. This involves a robust risk assessment that considers both immediate and long-term financial implications, informed by relevant international treaties and conventions. A structured decision-making process would include: 1. Identifying all relevant ethical principles and legal obligations, both domestic Alabama and international. 2. Quantifying all foreseeable costs and benefits, including direct financial figures and estimations of intangible economic impacts. 3. Evaluating the potential risks and rewards associated with different courses of action, considering scenarios of compliance and non-compliance. 4. Making a decision that maximizes long-term value while upholding ethical standards and legal requirements.